When we were talking about what I would talk about, I was thinking about the times that we're in right now, where we are in this moment of these two enormous crises. One is the ecological crisis of climate change and the meltdown of many of the Earth's climate systems and life support systems. And the other is this tremendous social justice crisis of galloping inequality and the increasing brutality and violence that's being used to maintain it. Actually, those aren't two crises. Those are the same crisis. That the systems that are destroying the environment and undermining our life support systems are the same systems that are maintaining this great inequality and widening it. And what prevents us from addressing climate change in the environment are, again, those systems of power. So I think it's a fruitful time right now to look at questions of power and to look at that intersection of nature and spirituality and activism, which is something that has been kind of core to my work and thinking for many decades now, and a few more. So I want to start by just reading you something from City of Refuge, from my latest book, which is, it's kind of a sequel to The Fifth Sacred Thing, to my sort of utopian, dystopian novel, though it also is a standalone book. But it goes, How to Make a Revolution. Tinder dry, these times we live in. Resentments and injustices pile up like brush, awaiting a spark to set them alight. Any fool can toss away a smoldering butt and start a blaze. Before you do, consider, how will you survive the inferno? A firestorm creates its own wind, makes its own weather. Be like the redwoods. Let it go, that tangle of underbrush, that overgrown field of bracken. You don't need it. Release it. Sing up the old gods of storm and rain, Oya, Orisha of the whirlwind of sudden change. Learn to love lightning and thunder. Disruption, destruction are the necessary agents of renewal. Embrace disturbance. Guard your heartwood. Turn your attention underground to the root mass, the mycelial threads that link tree to tree. The wall of flame will pass, and even if all that remains above are blackened posts, retain your faith. Life renews itself from below, from what is hidden. Out of seared bark poke new shoots. Green gauze covers the charred land, and a trill breaks the silence. High atop the skeleton of the tallest tree, perched on a scorched limb, one defiant bird lifts its head to the sky and sings. So I like to start with that because I think that what we are in need of now as a counter to these times of destruction is a deep understanding of regeneration. And regeneration, as that passage says, is something that arises actually only from disturbance and destruction. How many of you are gardeners? Great. If you are a gardener, you know that fertility is dependent on decay. You don't have fertile soil unless you have death and decay. And that, to me, is, I think, the core understanding that we need to link together the ecological movement, the spiritual movement, and the shifts and the changes that we need to make. So That's going to be kind of the underlying topic of what I want to talk about today. Much of what my work has been might fall into the category of ecofeminism. And I know some of you are studying political movements, and ecofeminism is one of the things I believe on your agenda. So I wanted to say a bit about that movement, which, sometime in the 80s, that's a word that started to be used. Part of it was inspired by Susan Griffin's amazing work, Woman in Nature, The Roaring Inside Her, which I think just had its 40th anniversary of publication, which was a tremendously beautiful book that really talked about the ways in which we view women are similar to the ways we view and understand the earth. And many of us who'd been involved in both environmental and ecological movements and in the feminist movement were looking at what today we tend to call intersectionality. We are looking at the way that different movements and different systems of oppression intertwine and are actually part of the same overarching system. So we began to see that, yes, when we talk about the rape of the earth, it's not just a metaphor. It actually goes deeply into our understanding of who has the right and the entitlement to what part of the earth body and what part of a woman's body, and why it is that we seem to treat them in the same way. When we talk about the earth being our mother, that is a metaphor. It's also a very profound spiritual metaphor that goes through many, many different indigenous cultures around the world. But it also goes into some of the deep psychological questions about how we respond to the earth in somewhat the same ways we respond to our mothers. We love our mothers. We're dependent on our mothers. We resent the hell out of our mothers because we love and are dependent on them. Our mothers feed us and nurture us. Our mothers also discipline us and impose limits and impose boundaries on us. And I think many people experience the earth and nature much in that same way. And our response to it may be acceptance, may be reverence, or it may be rebellion and resentment. And I think that goes deep into the question of why it is so challenging for us to actually respond today to climate change. So ecofeminism, I like to think of it as having kind of three core insights. The first is, I love to see all you college students dutifully taking notes on that. It's good. I'm going to try to make it easy to take notes on. So, insight number one is the interconnectedness of oppressions. That sexism is not separate from racism, that racism and sexism are not separate from class oppression, heterosexism, ableism, all of those things. They are intertwined into a whole structure of inequality. And each one of them helps to maintain the others. So sexism is part of helping to maintain racism. Racism is part of helping to maintain sexism, because you can, if you can convince anyone that their problems are actually due to some other group, or that they are somehow, by virtue of some actually extraneous factor, like their genitalia or their skin color, superior to some other group, then it's very easy to keep them focused away from the people who might actually be oppressing them or imposing constraints on the possibilities of their lives. And I think we see that a lot today, and we have seen that over and over again throughout history. You can't separate out those things. You can't say one is the primary oppression, because they all go together. And they go together in an overarching structure that basically tells us some people, a few people, are like the people that count. And the rest are just sort of filler, background. We all tend to experience the world in some ways that way. We're each the center of our own world, and around that center we've got a few people that really count a whole lot to us, because they're our family, our friends, our lovers, our intimates, or even sometimes our closest enemies, but the ones who we interact with. And then there's a vague world of people out there that get sort of vaguer and vaguer as you go further out. But that view becomes really destructive when it becomes a worldview, when it becomes a moral view, when we say, oh, the people like us are the people that count, and those other people out there don't really matter. That's why it's important to say something like Black Lives Matter. It's a way of saying, hey, those lives that this culture has said don't matter for so many hundreds of years, if we say Black Lives Matter, we are saying that there are no filler people, that every person on the planet has value, and that we need to undo these structures that take value away from so many people on the planet. So that would be insight number one. Insight number two is that the environmental movement, the ecology movement, and the social justice movement have to be the same movement. They are not separate movements. That environmental destruction falls most heavily on people who, because of social injustice, have been at the bottom of the heap. It falls most heavily on women, on people of color, on indigenous people, and we can see that with climate change. That the people who are suffering the most from it are probably the people who've contributed the least to it. We've just seen, horrible hurricanes and flooding in places like Houston and the Caribbean, but very rarely are we actually talking about 42 million people in India and Bangladesh who've been displaced at the same time because of the extreme monsoons that are another aspect of climate change. So if we stand for social justice, we need to be involved in the environmental movement. We can't have a movement, we can't reach justice for anyone if we've undercut the basis of life. And if we are part of the environmental movement, we have to also understand that it's not a movement just about saving polar bears or wildlife or sequoias, as wonderful and amazing as those things are. It is a movement that is deeply involved with the lives of humans and our interactions in the world. Because if we don't approach it that way, we are not going to be successful in shifting the big, huge systems we need to shift in order to bring the world back into balance. So that's insight number two. And insight number three is that what we call spiritual and what we call political is a false dichotomy. That the political change is deeply spiritual, because the kind of political change that we need to make is not just a question of who's in power. It's a question of how power operates in the world. It's not just a question of, who's sitting in the governor's office or the White House. It's a question of what are the deep underlying values of our society and how are we enacting them and how are we living them. And I think that the left has historically been highly influenced by a period in history when progressive people, people who wanted change and liberation and, to get out from under the yoke of hierarchy, when they very much saw religion as part of the problem, because they were dealing with dogmatic religions, Catholicism, Protestantism, primarily. Marx said religion was the opiate of the people, and because of that, liberatory politics has often defined itself as secular. We're against any of this religion, we're against false belief systems. I think that had its place and its time. But the problem is, first of all, spirituality is not necessarily about dogma and belief systems. It's about the way we engage with the deepest questions of our lives. Things like, what is life for? And why are we here? What's my purpose being here on the earth? And, why do we die? And what happens when we die? And if we die, what does that mean about my purpose, for being here? How is my life impacted by knowing that it's finite, that it's going to end, that I'm not here forever? What am I called to do? What are the values that we need to live by in order to live a good and a decent life? And I think if we don't engage with those questions politically, then what happens is we abandon them. And we abandon them to the right wing and the fundamentalists, who are very happy to take them up and provide really, clear, simple answers to all of those questions. There's a lot of studies have shown people don't actually vote their self-interest. They vote their morals, however they define them. Thomas Church wrote a book called What's the Matter with Kansas? And, why is it people in middle America vote, why is it Trump voters, many of whom are the ones who stand to lose their health care, voted for him? And the answer is because they're not necessarily saying, what's in my best self-interest? They're saying, who do I identify with? Who speaks for values that resonate with me? And oftentimes, the progressive forces, the Democrats, tend to speak in terms of policies and statistics and rationality, which under the illusion or whatever that rational human beings will make rational decisions. But I don't know if you're familiar with the work of George Lakoff, the linguist. He's a wonderful linguist and political theorist who's written a number of books about politics, including one called Moral Politics. And what he talks about is how people identify with the frames that they are used to for making sense of the world. And that we are moved not so much by reason and statistics, but actually by frameworks and stories. And he identifies two big stories in American politics. One is the strict father frame, the idea that the country's like a family, and life is tough, and it needs a strong father figure at the helm, to make sure everything is going to go okay. That because life is tough, you need to face it with discipline. And that discipline means, if you do wrong, you should be punished. And if you're not punished, then you're being coddled. And if you help people too much, you're actually making them weak. And things like, giving people charity, taking care of people who are sick, all those softer values are actually signs of weakness. There's another frame he talks about that he calls more the nurturing parent frame. And he very deliberately says parent, not nurturing mother, because he says that that gender division that says, women are nurturing, men are aggressive, is very much part of that strict father frame. And in the nurturing parent frame, there's room for men to be nurturing and caring. And the idea is that the country is like a family, and that what a family does is it takes care of its own. And that things like sickness and illness and adversity and loss happen to all of us in life. We just don't get through life without it. And that the impacts of those things should be shared and spread around so they don't fall on one unfortunate person, but that we all take part in caring for one another. If you understand those different frames, it makes sense of questions like, why are people who are, anti-abortion, who really, are intent on every woman who gets pregnant should have that child, why are they also often anti-health care? They're willing to make you have that kid, but they aren't willing to put any money into taking care of it once it's born and it gets sick, or providing an education for it. And it's because, again, of that strict father frame. That sexuality is very much what morality is about. And sex outside of marriage or sex outside of procreation is still suspect and wrong. And so if you engage in that, you should bear the consequences of it. And if that consequence is a child, well, then you should bear that child. And if you're going to be self-reliant, take care of yourself, then why should I pay for your sickness? Whereas from the nurturing parent frame, you say like, okay, we are all in this together. So if we are going to bring children into this family, then we have a responsibility to care for children. If people are sick, we have a responsibility to help and take care of them because, any one of us could get sick at any time. If someone is hurt, it shouldn't be just up to that person to deal with that. It's something that we should all be part of helping with and dealing with. And the thing is that we all carry some of each frame. The most wildly progressive single-payer health care Bernie fan in here, whoever you are, somewhere deep inside has moments where you kind of say, that kid needs some discipline or they're never going to survive in life. Right? We need some self-reliance. We can't just depend on everybody else. And even the most die-hard Trump supporter, you dig deep inside, somewhere inside will say, well, actually, I do have some compassion for other people. I do understand that, someone can get hurt, it cannot be their fault. We should actually help each other. But what happens in politics is we're always activating one frame or another. And when we activate that frame of punishment and retribution over and over and over again, we tend to start to accept it as the norm. And it becomes harder and harder to counter it whenever we actually accept that frame and argue in its terms. So if we're arguing about how much or how little someone deserves health care, or how we should provide it to the deserving poor but not the undeserving poor, we bought into that frame and we have lost. If we're arguing about health care, even on the rational grounds of, it would cost a lot less money to provide health care for people than to have them show up in emergency rooms all the time, we've lost. We need to be talking about this in terms of a different set of sacred values. We need to actually strongly speak for our own frame and say, well, actually, we provide health care for people because that is what moral people do. We take care of each other. And we try to cushion the blows of fate. And when we do that, then we ourselves ultimately benefit from it. But we do it not just because we benefit, but because that's what being a decent human being is about. And I will say that I've heard Bernie Sanders speak in those terms, and I think that's one reason why he is such a powerful speaker and politician. So in ecofeminism, as we came to understand this, we also could look at patriarchal religion and say, well, okay, it is true that a lot of the ways we've looked at religion or spirituality are telling us some very old stories. They're telling us that strict father story. They're telling us a very deep story in Western culture that goes back hundreds of years that basically says spirit and nature are separate. They're two different, separate things. And nature, the world, the body, is not the important part. The important part is this thing that's disembodied, that's transcendent, whether that's in the old story, God and heaven. You know, this world, this life is not the important life. It's the next life that you're preparing for. Then later that story transformed, and now the story is really this world, like the actual reality of the things that sustain our lives are not the deep important things. It's this abstraction we call profit that somehow, I hate to say the word, but trumps every value, every other value in the world. And that story, I think, is killing us. Because if we don't actually value this world and this life and our real bodies and the real things that sustain them, then it's very easy for us to destroy them. So I would say the other insight of ecofeminism, the overarching insight, is a resacralizing of the living world. Understanding that the earth is alive, the earth is sacred, and we are part of that life. And that there's a spirituality that emerges from that that's very different from a dogma or a great book or a belief system, but goes to the root of our immediate lived experience in the world. So I think one of the things we've seen that I find very, very hopeful right now is the emergence of things like the movement at Standing Rock, which was very much telling us this is about water is sacred, water is life. You know, not just stop the pipeline, but let us actually claim these things that sustain our lives and say these are sacred to us. Sacred, not in the sense like let's all bow down to it, but sacred in the sense of something is sacred, it's something you really deeply care about. It's something that has a value that goes beyond your personal convenience or your personal profit. And it is something you don't want to see defiled or destroyed or compromised. It actually sets the standard by which other things are judged. So, you know, right now I think we are in this crisis around climate change in part because the reality of climate change goes against a very deep cultural story that we hold. And that's the story of progress. The story that tells us we have triumphed over nature. We now have science, we now have technology. We are no longer bound by nature's constraints. And again, from an ecofeminist point of view, we can look at that and say, well, in some ways that's like the adolescent boys saying, yeah, mom can't tell me what to do anymore, right? You know, I'm no longer under her control. There's many ways in which we have, you know, we have amazing things. You know, I have an iPhone that carries more computing power in it than we had in the entire world when we put a man on the moon back in the 60s. We can fly across the air, we can drive, hundreds of miles. We can do all these amazing technological things. And many, many people live in a world that is far more technological than natural in their daily experience. But what climate change tells us is, in the end, none of that stands up to 185-mile-an-hour winds. None of that stands up to a hurricane. None of that stands up to 1 million burning acres over the state of Montana. The natural world and the constraints and the patterns and the laws of nature actually are ultimately far more powerful than we are. And I think that's a very hard truth for us, because it breaks that fantasy that somehow we can be immortal. It pushes us back into the world where we inhabit bodies that are born and that are ultimately going to die. And it forces us again to come up against the idea of finitude and limitations and constraints. I think one of our problems also is in the environmental movement, we tend to counter that with a story that's more like the story of sin and punishment. We tend to tell people, like, we're in this mess because of our selfishness, because of our badness. And to get out of it, you must sacrifice. You must do penance. You must give up things that you might want or you might care for because it's you who are killing the earth. Maybe not quite that blatantly, but if you think about a lot of the messages, often that's the underlying, meta story about it. So it's no wonder that, we don't have masses of people, descending on the oil companies and ripping them down with pitchforks, right? Because it's not a great story. If I tell you you are sinful, or, have you ever met environmentalists who basically sort of are saying, human beings are a blight on the planet and the earth would be better off without us? It's really hard to mobilize people around the idea the earth would be better off without them, right? And I also don't believe it's true, okay? I think it is a spiritual fallacy. Because if you actually look at what we need to do around climate change, it is true that we need to make some immense changes in things like our technology, our energy systems, our food growing systems, the ways that we produce the things that we need, the ways that we organize our society. But if you look at what those changes are, honestly, we're talking about a lot of nice things. We need to stop, polluting the estuaries of Nigeria with horrible oil extraction, or dumping toxic oil into the Ecuadorian rainforests, or destroying the tar sands and causing cancer to all the indigenous people who live downstream. Yeah, we need to stop doing those things, but to me those things do not equate to some terrible sacrifice. We need to start growing food without poisoning it. We need to build soil. We need to shift, instead of burning stuff to make energy, to using the incredibly abundant flows of energy that are here on the planet. I have a dear friend who's an engineer from Catalonia he says, we do not have an energy crisis. We have far more energy showering the planet every day than we could possibly need or use. What we have is a crisis of management. We have the assumption that we make energy. He says we've got to shift from fire to flow. Instead of burning stuff, to using these flows of sunlight, of wind, of water. And if we do that, energy is abundant on this planet. It's not lacking. We have carbon in the atmosphere that is beyond the tipping point for climate change, and we're seeing that. This summer we have seen all the predictions, what would happen with climate change. There would be massive forest fires that were impossible to put out because of heat waves and drought. There would be unprecedented heat waves in places like here today at the end of September, right? San Francisco, where I come from, it's just called Fog City because every time it's hot inland, it gets cold in San Francisco. And Mark Twain said the coldest winter he ever spent was one summer in San Francisco. We had a heat wave where it got to be 108 degrees. This has never happened before. We're seeing hurricanes. Hurricanes are natural, they happen all the time, but what the climate change predictions say is that climate change will intensify them, and we have seen, unbelievable amounts of rain dumped on Houston in 3 days. We have seen incredible strength and power of these storms over and over and over again. So it's not like we aren't, we're seeing the glaciers melting and the ice caps melting, and all of those things are happening right now. It's not in the future sometime. But we also do have the capacity to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and to sequester it in ways that are not only safe, but actually help us make some of these changes. And we do that using an amazing technology that's radically new on the planet. It's only been around for several 100 million years. It's called plants and soil and microorganisms. Plants photosynthesize. They take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they use it to build their plant bodies, and they use it to feed a whole ecosystem of microorganisms under the earth that take some of that carbon and turn it into things like humus that build soil fertility. That soil repair also helps repair the water cycle, which also has a tremendous impact on the warming of the planet. So, we have the capacity, again, to turn this around. I don't know if we have the capacity to ever go back to what it was before climate change, but we still have the capacity to regenerate the world into a place that will provide lives of beauty and joy and delight and abundance for you young people who live here right now, and your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But we have a narrow window of time in which to do that. And in order to do that, I think we need to be telling a different story. We need to be telling the story of regeneration. And that is the story that's at the heart of the indigenous cultures of everywhere. There are thousands of indigenous cultures, and they're all different. I don't want to say they're all the same, but there's a way in which they hold a common understanding, and that is, again, that the world is a cycle of birth and growth and death and regeneration, and that death and decay are part of that cycle. We have to understand that in our own lives, and we have to understand that in the natural world. And that is also the core understanding that was there in the ancient goddess traditions in Europe and the Middle East. It is there, I think, at the heart of every culture that lives together in harmony with the natural world. Because if you don't understand that cycle, actually you don't survive. So I want to stop talking for a bit now and leave a little time for questions and comments. But I'll just close by saying I'm actually very hopeful. I think we live in a tremendously exciting time. Certainly not boring. I believe that we are each here for a reason, and that we each have a role to play in bringing about this regeneration of the world. And that what we need to be doing in our social movements and our political movements is looking at the ways, how do we support each one of us to find what our role is, what our niche is, and be supported in playing that, and find the ways that they fit together and work together. And if we do that, I think we have a tremendous capacity right now to heal and renew the world. So I'd like to open it up for your questions and comments.
Yeah. Anybody has a question? If you want to raise your hand, I will bring a microphone to you. Sure. I'm not sure if this is... You can talk real loud.
You started out talking about renewal and destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And could you give us some more examples, or some personal examples?
Uh-huh.
Okay, maybe we'll take a few questions,
Yeah.
and then... so the question here was about renewal and destruction, some personal examples or concrete examples.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a question? No.
You want to accumulate it?
Yeah, maybe a few.
You dared to use the word Trump several times with several different meanings. I'm wondering, in the context of hopefulness of the various things that are going on in terms of regeneration, how do you and how do we and how does one deal with the crazy person in the White House and the possibility of a nuclear war that he would start just because his ego is fragile?
Maybe one more question? Yeah.
What do you think of Joanna Macy's work, the work that reconnects
Your work
and to it?
Okay.
All right, I'll start with your question, a really beautiful question. So what are some examples of the way that we need disturbance? One of them comes from ecology. There's the work of a man named Alan Savory, who has done this tremendous work around grazing and grasslands. He was a ranger in Zimbabwe and watching the grasslands deteriorate over and over and over again, and they didn't know why. They thought, okay, people are overgrazing it, so they took all the cattle off and the grasslands deteriorated more. They thought, okay, there's too many elephants. They're overgrazing. They got rid of 40,000 elephants. He said it was the worst mistake ever of his life to reduce their population, and the grasslands deteriorated more. Finally, what he realized was they were asking the wrong question. They were asking how many animals are on each acre of land, when what they should have been asking is how long does each animal spend in each spot before they move on, and how much time does the grass have to regenerate? And he started to look at the ecology, and he realized that grasslands co-evolve with grazers, especially grasslands in areas that are brittle, that don't get regular moisture throughout the year but have dry periods. They need the disturbance of herds of grazers to knock that grass down and get it in contact with the earth and trample it and dig it into the earth and pee on it and poo on it so that it gets in contact with biology and begins to decay. If they don't have that disturbance, the grass just kind of stands there and petrifies. And you won't see that so much in Vermont, but if you come out to California where I live, you see it very, very clearly. So he began what he calls a system of holistic management grazing, or mob grazing, where that mimics the way that animals behave when there's predators around. You know, when there's predators, herds of grazers like bunch together. You know, the buffalo stick together because the wolves are out there and they're safer in that crowd. And when they're all together, they trample an area, they pee all over it, they poo all over it, and they move on because they don't want to eat that stuff after it's all been, you know, pooed on. Right? And they don't come back for a while, and the grass has time to regenerate. And when you do that, it builds soil underground. It builds whole colonies of microorganisms and whole ecologies underground that are continually building soil and building humus. And that's how we got things like topsoil 20 feet deep in the prairies that were connected to the bison and the buffalo. So knowing that, then we can understand in our systems we need to apply disturbance. That's sort of a practical ecological example. Maybe a more personal example is, any of you ever been in a bad relationship? You know, have you ever been in one of those relationships where you're sort of there and it's not really working, but you don't, you know, like getting out of it would be a big mess, and so you put up with it and you put up with it and you put up with it, and sometimes you could live your whole life like that. But sometimes what it really takes is a big disturbance to shake it all up, to say, okay, this has to either radically change or I have to move on to somebody else. And that might actually open up the opportunity to have a deep and intimate and meaningful relationship in your life. But if we are afraid of that, if we're trying to avoid that all the time, then often we constrict ourselves in ways, and kind of like that grass, we just sort of stand there and ossify. I'll answer the Joanna Macy question because it's easy, it's quick. Yeah, I think she does amazing work. She does work, the work that reconnects is really about acknowledging our grief and our despair. Again, allowing us to go into that disturbance and feel that and not resist it. And when you do that, then grief has a sort of a cycle of its own. My mother actually was a therapist whose specialty was loss and grief. And she always used to say that, again, if you don't avoid you can't avoid the grieving. If somebody dies, if you lose somebody, you can't just not feel it. But if you let yourself feel it, it takes you through a process that in the end leaves you more open, maybe more compassionate, more capable of actually feeling joy and love and connection. As far as dealing with the madman in the White House, right? You know, when Nixon was in the White House and was drinking heavily, the military actually put out a sort of secret directive that just said to the guys who sit there with the button and the nuclear thing, said, if you get something from him saying push the button, don't do it unless you check with us. I hope they're doing the same thing. On the other hand, when you have to pin your hopes for the world's survival on a few military men disobeying the commander-in-chief, you're in a bad way. So I think we really desperately need to hold Trump accountable and hold all the forces accountable that put him into that position, and get him out. And people will say, well, then we'll get Pence. Well, that's true, although it seems like Pence may also be implicated in the whole Russian scandal. But I think if we don't do that for Trump, then we are colluding with something that is really nasty and colluding with efforts that I think are becoming more and more clear to influence our elections for ends that are not democratic and not even located in our own country. So we need to be really active and proactive around limiting that and getting him out. I think that we had done, in many ways, a really good job of standing up to the racism and the hatred that he has. It's not like he created it, but he sort of unleashed it, gave it voice, and gave it legitimacy. So, you know, when millions of women turned out on the Women's March, that was vitally important in standing up and saying, no, you know, you do not have a mandate. No, that is not going to be the norm. When thousands of people turned out to the airports to block his original airport ban, that was tremendously effective and empowering. When people stand up and take action, you know, when fascists have marched in places like Boston and the Bay Area and Vancouver, and thousands of people have turned out to counter them, it has turned them back, and they have basically gone home and not shown up. Because it's a way of us saying, no, here are a set of values we stand for. And the majority of people in this country, I believe, do actually stand for values. Say, we do care about other human beings. We do value people who may not look exactly like us. We do want to live in a world of justice. So in some ways, maybe this really horrible period we find ourselves in can be like that disturbance, you know, where things crash down, and out of that, it's up to us to pull regeneration and speak for the really deep values that we hold.